Thank you everybody for coming today. It's definitely very exciting. I'm also a little bit more known from more of the metaphysical community as opposed to the disclosure community, but I'm definitely trying to make more of a bridge for that. I was also thinking of a little way to introduce some of these serious topics with a little bit of levity, since we have so many multi-layers, each of us as speakers. And as synchronicity would have it, when I got my Snapple today for my breakfast, it's a great way to introduce it, you'll laugh. So you know they have little sayings on the Snapple caps, right? So I've had Snapple for many years, I've never seen this one. It says, federal law once allowed the government to quarantine people who came in contact with aliens. I was like, okay. We'll take a toast now. And that's a perfect way to open my story. And I think many of us in this room. Yeah, very, very quick. So for me, I kind of entered more into the observation of the Covert community more from a spiritual angle, more from an esoteric angle, as opposed to being brought into some Supersoldier program or being involved in an actual project as an engineer or as a psychic. And so it's developed over the years, and I've kind of talked about aspects of it to close friends and some public forums, and over through some forums, more through Blog Talk Radio, aspects of it, but I haven't disclosed all the details of it. Today will be more highlighted aspects of some of the keynote points, and I'll be making a series of videos to go deeper into those areas over time. Pretty much, part of my story started in 1992, which part of the background for this had to do with my ability to remember how to look into the sun. So it started from sun gazing, which may seem like a really odd way to get on a magical list, so to speak, of some of the NSA and CIA Black Op community, but it was pretty funny. In retrospect, it's funny, as many of these stories are once you begin to heal them in your own journey. Pretty much in that beginning point, I was interested in studying different spiritual philosophies, and doing work with the sun was one of the main keys that activated my Kundalini and began activating my own journey to discover more of who I was beyond the scope of this lifetime as a spiritual divine being. And this is now in the context of Newark, New Jersey, just so you can give a little visual graphic, where I grew up at, in the abyss. So I'm on a building in Newark, New Jersey, and my guides say that I need to begin to look into the sun in an altered state. That time I was a physics major at NYU, which I did not complete. So I had a little bit of a contrast going on between my left and right brains about if I should indeed do this or not, or if I was going to be blind because of my own, lack of discernment. But my heart really spoke out to me and really called me and said that no, you needed to really do this to really access this divine source of unity and love that the sun was a direct vehicle of. And that we've all taken it for granted so many times, although ancient cultures were much more adept at integrating this amazing life-giving rays for their spiritual evolution and physical growth. So from that point of view, I said I was going to jump into the abyss and look into the sun in an altered state and invoke some of my allies and spirit guides. And I did that, and that transformed my life. I basically had seen these incredible, tall, golden, androgynous light beings who came down, which I was like, okay, who are these tall beings? At that point, I'd already felt angels and other sorts of positive and negative extraterrestrial influences, but this was a whole new group, a whole new category. As they came down, they were basically tall, golden, androgynous light beings. And they had miniature suns, or like plasma orbs, as their heart chakras. And they kind of just held me from all different angles, and I collapsed on the ground, and I started crying profusely out of love, and I was like, oh my God, this is so biblical for me, in the sense of who these presences are. I'm like, who are you guys? And they were like, oh, you're actually one of us, just in a 3D body, and we're in our normal 6D bodies. I'm like, okay, that feels right, although it blew my whole conceptual patterns about what reality was out of the window at that point. So that began a nice long journey of working with these higher beings who basically told me that we have to expand our conception of what extraterrestrials are about. It's not just about aliens living on planets, in 3D or 4D or 5D, but that every level, every fractal layer of the creator spiral is inhabited with some form of sentient intelligence, that the one infinite creator is self-aware on all levels of its creation, which is infinite. And so to limit the scope to extraterrestrials, to planets, is equally reductionistic, as we are doing with our own mechanistic society. It's only to talk about them in ships or things like that. So part of the basic point is that these higher solar beings, that every star, they basically told me, was inhabited in higher dimensions by higher dimensional beings that at one point were in three-dimensional bodies like humans and other planets, and they evolved on a soul level to be able to embrace such intense levels of unity that their actual vehicle for their soul's expression was about this higher plasma environment where it was about love and unity. And to describe that reality is a longer side story. But it's important as a context because that was the beginning point of everything that I'll be discussing now. So after doing that for a little while, several times, and feeling all this incredible energy, normally they would put a golden solar dome of astral energy around my field as a kind of protection and privacy. And it was felt very secure, very stable. At that time, I was also beginning more of my quest into the conspiracy theory research, and I'd heard that there was a black helicopter facility somewhere near Newark, New Jersey. And so I was like, well, questioning that because I'd never seen one. I was used to seeing all sorts of air traffic around, you know, the city, living in Newark, about 20 minutes from the airport. And so I'd heard, though, normally in the background, especially this is before the internet, so we're getting our stories more from magazines and people at conventions, you know, it wasn't as accessible as it is now. I had heard that these helicopters were also upgrading their scoping capacity to be aware on certain occasions of people that were involved in opening up certain types of portals or vortexes, and that aside from them being interested in scanning areas for people that might have been contacted by extraterrestrials or UFO abductees, that they could also pick up on certain sensations or disturbances in the local grid that normally would be indicative when you have a higher presence coming in. So I was like, oh, I don't know if they have that. I was questioning it. I said, I want to see if our shadow government has the technology to pick up on what I'm doing and pick up on these higher, you know, 6-dimensional solar beings in a very vibrationally dense area in Newark, New Jersey. So I kind of opened up Pandora's box myself and wanted to, you know, push it. So I asked my guides lovingly that I wanted to decline privacy. I wanted protection, but I didn't want privacy. So if anybody had the viewing capacity to scope the area, I wanted them to see, because I wanted to play, you know, I'm Mars and Aquarius. I like to push a little bit. So the guides kind of shook their heads energetically, like, you really sure you want to do this? This is not really, you know, something you may not understand the full consequences. So being a rebellious 21-year-old, I'm like, no, I have to do this, you know, it's okay. So as the dome of light lifted up, I felt naked on the roof. 10 minutes into it, I had my headphones on. You know how you feel someone looking at you and you turn your head? Well, that happened to me, and I turned my head and there was a black helicopter, and I was like, oh, okay, that's interesting timing. You know? So, of course, it ended up doing about a half circle around me, and of course, it wasn't enough that it was just one time. I had to do a scientific experiment to make sure they indeed were spotting in my area. So I kept testing out each day, several days in a row, and this time they started flying in pairs, coming closer, following me to my job, like a couple of stories over my building, about to land on my roof, like that low. And I'm like, okay, they're obviously here checking out what's going on. And I started feeling some not so nice energy coming from the helicopters that was disturbing my whole field. So I got a little more concerned at that point. I was like, okay, privacy. I called that energy again. And then it stopped. But too little too late is, you know, that old saying, so to speak. So it helped me out temporarily, but I had already got on some of their, I guess I got on whatever that list was at the time, which would be kind of funny to actually read my file. But so it happened about 6 more times, and then it stopped again after I invoked protection. Then in '94, it occurred one more time, 6 days before my father passed away, at a major UFO sighting over Newark again. And this UFO flew in broad daylight and was changing shape, and it flew towards the hospital where my father was at. And he had always told me that he knew he wasn't from this planet on the soul level. So I kind of felt like the higher beings were giving him like the military salute, you know, goodbye, so to speak. And after the UFO disappeared over the hospital, 5 minutes after that, a black helicopter appears at the point where I last saw the UFO, and it retraced the whole trajectory back over my apartment building, and then back to the point where I saw the UFO emerge over the horizon. So at that point, I imagine they must have got even more interested. Like, oh, now they're like, who is this kid talking to a whole group of ETs now? You know, so you know, just I can imagine from their perspective, you know, that they would be interested in people that, you know, who aren't making contact, to be able to understand more of that situation for themselves as their own intelligence gathering, you know, forces. As there are multi-level projects that have gone on in these shadow groups over the years. Fast forward, 1996, 1997, I did my first couple workshops upstate in New York, in Norwich, New York. A friend of mine at the time had a small metaphysical center up there. And I was teaching some classes on the Kabbalah and solar mysticism and Egyptian mysticism. And that's where my journey kind of went down the rabbit hole into a very deep area that I hadn't fully recovered the memories of that until 11 years later, of what exactly happened to me up at that point. And which was one of the reasons why I hadn't really gotten into deeper discourse publicly about what had occurred until I got all the details over the past few years. There have been even more details that have surfaced and more confirmations from people that I confronted who had been connected to that facility and who also had been abducted at that same facility. Now this is up in Norwich, New York, which is about 40 minutes north of Binghamton. There are 2 towns adjacent to that, a few minutes away. One's called Bowman Lake and the other one's called Green. And there was an individual I met up there through the community who was a so-called former psychic warrior for the government, who is now doing, out of his graciousness of his heart, he was doing healing work, channeling praying mantis ETs, which I at first was not, I was kind of creeped out by that group. Not that I have anything against them, but they didn't feel warm and cozy to me, like some of my other groups that I've accessed. So anyway, I got a little weird vibe off of him, and I asked him, you know, do you do any more work up here with the government, or is it only in the past? He goes, well, I do some contract work once in a while for the government still. But he didn't elucidate what that was, and I realized later on, part of the contract work was to set people up to be taken to this facility, which was underground over there. And he wanted me to go hiking with him out in the woods at that point too, which was interesting because I did want to do that. I like nature, but I felt very disturbed after that trip. I felt like I had some missing time, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it because by linear logical methods, it didn't seem like I had missing time. So that was something my left brain was using against me to try to deny what my subconscious was screaming out to me, that something was really wrong after that trip. And I started getting, anytime anybody wanted to bring me back upstate New York, I became very depressed. I could not go back upstate. I became allergic to honey from New York State. They're very bizarre physiological symptoms. So I'm like, oh, something happened up there that I'm in serious denial about, but I just kind of put it in the background for a while. One other thing that that individual told me about, he was always talking about the different UFOs that were over the area and about some of the battles that happened between some of the light ships and some of the negative ET groups, and that there was a connection. He actually did mention to me also briefly that there was an underground base nearby, but he did not want to go into that detail, and I didn't want to push it at the time, which I should have, but I'd since been in contact with him, and he's confirmed to me many details that I later on gathered, which I also owe to Preston Nichols, which will be coming later on. At a journey I met Preston many years ago through Alan and through Peter Moon's group, and Preston Nichols had developed a sound system, which I'm sure he'll be talking about later in the symposium, which was a major trigger for me to activate a key repressed memory seal, through which later on many of the memories came flooding into me, and then I've been piecing together the puzzle over a couple of years since that point. Because there's a little bit of a timeline, that I want to go into a little bit here. Because remember, I wasn't aware of the abduction part first. So then, a few months after that, in 1997, I was beginning to do some journeys to take groups to certain sacred sites to do more like planetary healing work, planetary grid work. We were calling Orion Stargate Activation Series. And part of this was about grounding some energy at different points that would help bring in positive energy from the stars of Orion. And part of that was to counter some of the negative stargates or negative portal or misuse of portals that the negative groups from Orion have been doing for a very long time behind the scenes. And so 3 weeks prior leading the first group to Cahokia Indian Mountains out in Illinois, which was the epicenter of the first of these series, I had 3 series of attacks, so to speak, which began to open my own view about, well, there's something else bigger going on here. It wasn't just about the helicopters. They kind of, I'm just going to gloss over them a little quickly because there's a lot of stories to go through here in this time period. So the first one was more of a remote viewer. I want to say one of the 3 attacks was more from was my first experience of remote influencers and remote viewers. And each of them started off in the dream plane first before I woke up and could sense what was going on was actually real in my room and I needed to take action against it. In the first one, there were a team of about 6 or 7 of these guys dressed in camouflage that I could see in the dream plane, and they were hovering outside my window trying to peek in, and in the dream plane there were black helicopters. So that didn't feel nice to me, so I kind of woke myself up and I was like, oh man, what is this? I'm being paranoid or something, So, but then all of a sudden I tried to go back to sleep and I could feel, being at that point quite telepathic and being sensitive to higher beings for many years, but this was different. I had not felt strictly a human presence before that was trying to project in the room. I was more used to feeling angels and guides or ETs, not the very basic human signature. So this was like very clear and very distinctive. I could see the leader of the pack, so to speak, of that special unit, kind of sitting there energetically in my room, and his team were outside the building, not able to get in yet. And so he starts to telepathically communicate with me in a very direct way, and I was like, oh, this is kind of trippy and interesting, what's happening. So I'm like, I'm going to go along with this dialogue because this is intriguing to me as well. So I was like, okay, where are you? He goes, well, whenever there are negative ET incidents within US territory, it sets off an alarm on the inner planes, and we send out a team to investigate the area. So I was like, oh, that sounds pretty intriguing, and if that's true, that's pretty cool, So I'm like, all right, keep going. And at that point, I'm like, well, who are you? Why are you here? He goes, well, we're what you can call the inner plane hitmen for the government. And I was like, inner plane hitmen for the government? Sounds like a bad B-rated movie at that time, I'm like, okay, well then what? That doesn't make me feel too comfortable that you're here, I'm thinking to myself. And at that point, one of the few times up to that point, I felt the female angel fly by me, like really visually, as close as I can see you guys, fly by me, and she said, put up the pentagrams. And at that point, that was a reference to me of a particular protection ritual that I would do involving the lesser banishing ritual of the pentacles, which is a Kabbalistic ritual, where you're calling on the archangels of the 4 directions and different god names to sanctify your space. So I've been doing it every day, so I didn't have enough time to get up and do the whole ritual, so I just wanted to affirm it, and I visualized the pentacles forming a shield of love and light around me, and I felt it push him back, and he got really angry at that point. And he said that pentagrams are very complex thought forms that we have trouble breaking through, and it takes us blah 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 a certain amount of time. That was at least back then, you know, the way I had it. They seemed to not be as intimidated by it a few years later when I had to do more advanced techniques to block them out. But at that time, at least, it was working well. And then I just called them more guides, and then it was fine. And I had a little bit of post-traumatic, you know, shock feeling about their energy the next morning when I woke up, and thought that was pretty creepy. So then, about a week later, so there were 2 other incidents. This next one was more esoteric. It started off in the dream plane again. This time it was more of a group of people that were part of a darker kind of satanic coven who were trying to attack me in the dream plane. And there was a whole beautiful series of energies and incidents that came in and saved me basically at that point. And I woke up and I could feel there was a group trying to come in, and my guides were like, you need to put up extra shields right now because there are humans who are projecting astrally who don't have your best interest in mind. So I was like, oh, how about a very nice, non-judgmental way to describe it? So I said, okay. That's a longer story, but I did a special protection for that. And then I come to find out years later from another guy who was teaching remote viewing to different police groups. This is several years ago. He was, at the time I met him, he was finishing his clinical psychology degree at West Point, and his dad was high-level NSA and Army. And I didn't really trust him, but I kind of was intrigued by him as well, and he ended up turning against me, and we had major psychic attack battles going on for a few months after we ended our friendship. After he ended it, I should say. But one of the things he confirmed to me at that point, before we ended it, was that he said that one of the things that his group or some people in the covert military would do is that they would hire out some of these satanic groups, and he mentioned New York specifically, that they would hire out some of the Santeria groups in Washington Heights to also as another layer of psychological harassment against people that they wanted to intimidate. So I said, oh, that makes sense, because I experienced some of that before, just in terms of seeing these astral presences. So it's a nice bridge to understand that we're not just dealing with technology, we're also dealing with a cult, we're dealing with consciousness, and groups that seek to manipulate consciousness at whatever cost and whatever methodology that they can do, they have tried to and experimented with. So again, it's not about creating fear, it's about being aware, so we're able to know that we are more powerful, and that the more they try to mess with our consciousness, the more we can claim our own higher consciousness field and be able to transmute it and have more compassion and be able to ground more of that victory energy over that challenge. So then, after that second point, third one, that was my first experience of more of a directed energy weapon technology projection. And this time, before I fell asleep, because each of these attacks were 7 days apart, I asked my guides, I said, okay, I want to get a little heads up this time about what's going on. Give me a little notice. So I go to sleep and I have an out-of-body experience, and I'm in front of the NSA headquarters down in Fort Meade, and I'm seeing the guy from the first attack, except this time he's dressed more in a suit, and he's talking to his boss behind a table. And it was very quick OBE, and he made a reference to me, and he goes, that direct attacks won't work on him, we'll have to try to wear him down emotionally, mentally. Boom, I snapped back on my body. I was like, oh shit, what does that mean? So I was like, what does that mean? So, of course, what I should have done was immediately done protection, but I decided to just write it off as being paranoia again, which I was a little dense at the time. So, a few hours later, I started feeling really depressed out of nowhere. Just very small things that happened became as if they were like making a mountain out of a molehill. Certain situations occur, and they were snowballed. And I started feeling my crown chakra get cut off. I felt like a weight come over my body, and really, really depressed. And I started getting images of suicide, which I never get. I'm like, wow, what is that? At that point, it triggered my own spiritual warrior side, and said, wait a minute, this is being projected. This is not you. You need to be able to discern what is your stuff versus what stuff is sending you. So at that point, I started doing protection because I got very angry about that. And the vividness of the images were very strong, and the emotions with them also were very tangible. So I did a lot of protection and clearing. It took me about a day and a half to really clear off the residue of that. So I wanted to then research. I'm like, how are they doing that? What does this technology involve? Then I come to realize, well, later on that they have several different types of technologies that can do that. One of them is through the microwave bandwidth, where they found out that they can take, they've taken really advanced digital brainwave maps of people in different emotional states. And they found that they can piggyback a bandwidth of microwave as a carrier wave for that specific emotional state and target people individually, kind of like next level subliminal technology. So all of a sudden you start feeling that emotion, even though it's not yours. Again, that's only if you're not aware of it. Once you're aware of it, you can screen it out, because our brain or auric field is used to being a filter, especially living in a city. If you live in a big city, you have to deal with psychic static and background noise all the time. So it's kind of a refinement of you training your field to detect that feeling if you happen to be in that situation, to be able to then block it out. So that was later confirmed to me by the first official NSA contact that I had, I should say, which was in 01, right a month after 9/11. I was working part-time for New Jersey Transit as a part-time supervisor for the Lincoln Tunnel Park and Ride in Jersey. We have a couple thousand cars park a day and they take the bus into Port Authority. That became like spook central for me. I started having all these spooks visiting me there. I'm like, why are they all visiting me at my job here? It was kind of strange to me. I understood I was doing some things that I wasn't fully aware of, but all of a sudden it became like a regular occurrence from all different alphabet agencies. And I'm like, all right, this is getting a little creepy now. Obviously I'm missing a bigger part of my chapter here, and that was when, but the main first meeting, and they all walk in with their jackets on. They're not shy, like the way the FBI would have the FBI on their jacket. So he walks in with his NSA jacket. I'm like, oh, okay. Guess you're advertising these days. So much for covert, right? So at that point, you know, he just starts talking to me, you know, and I was like, oh, hi, you know. I'm like, I always wanted to share one of my stories with someone from your agency. I was in the bus disc shops, he's coming to me, right? So I relate to him some of the black helicopter stories, and then he tries to blame it on the CIA, but didn't want to talk about it more. I'm like, but he said he wanted to meet with me in the city and have a separate meeting. So I'm like, all right. So, you know, we ended up meeting in Bryant Park, all cloak and dagger like, and he's like the cigar man from the X-Files with those little cigarette there, looking around half nervously, you know. First part of the meeting, I'm like, and then we're talking. He's like 25 years in agency at that time, so he wasn't some little young little NSA guy, you know, like trying to time the ranks. He claimed to work for kind of like the equivalent of internal affairs for the NSA, where he was monitoring the investigators there, specifically for Communications Intelligence Division of the NSA. And so he started to confirm certain things. And he said that he was investigating abuses in the agency, and that my case fell within the range of potential abuse that he was investigating. So I'm like, all right, either he's playing like the bad cop, good cop role with me right now, but I'm gonna go with it because I'm having, what else would I do? I'm having fun with him too, and this is the first guy who's kind of me confirming that I'm not crazy and that some of these harassments were real. So when I started telling him some of the stories about the psychic work, tax, he didn't want to talk about it. As soon as I mentioned about the projections with the microwaves, he jumped on it. He goes, oh yeah, he goes, we use that all the time on people. It's a very common practice in the NSA. I was like, oh, really nice, really good job, guys, you know? And at first I'm like, so is it ELF waves or is it microwaves? Because I wanted to see what he said. He goes, no, it's microwaves. I'm like, well, do you need a local transmitter? He goes, no, we use satellite to target anybody we want worldwide with the signal. And he goes, it's very common, you know? And I'm like, okay, that's nice. I'm like, yeah. And so, you know, so that began a very strange relationship on and off for a few years after that, where he would intermittently meet with me, or he'd call me up, and or I'd call him up, and he'd be stationed at different places, and sometimes numbers, you know, would disappear, or like he'd work somewhere, and I get a strange operator. One company was called SOTEC, Special Operations Technology, which was down in like the Virginia area. But then he answered the phone for a while there through an operator, but then he left that area. And I busted the chops of the operator at that number. I asked him, well, what kind of technology is this guy still dealing with here? And the female operator starts laughing. She goes, you have to have clearance for that. I can't tell you what we're doing at this facility. And I'm like, all right, whatever. So then I'm going to fast forward because there are many, many stories with this. So then, in 2003, I started getting much more sophisticated attacks. Like, they were like 7 levels deep in terms of the microwave bandwidth, where they were like piggybacking one emotional state with subliminal messages and programs. And I was like, whoa, what is this crap? You know, so I'm like having to do advanced Egyptian magic, Kabbalistic work, just to go through layers of my psyche to understand what was planted there as artificial frameworks and symbol structures that they were putting. And I told this to the NSA guy, and he goes, well, they're trying to fine-tune their signals on you to see how you can block it out. And I'm like, wow, okay, only use me as a guinea pig. Give me money next time, jerk, you know? And he starts laughing. He goes, no, it's like, you know, not gonna happen. But then 2 years later, you know, he asked me, oh, do you want a job? Do you want a job? What are you doing? You know, and but then he didn't really. That was a whole other weirder situation. Then the whole table got more stranger, and he started threatening me. Now, I'm skipping a lot of different stories in between. I moved to Astoria. I was in Astoria in 2001 for about 9 years in Queens. And in 05, 06, 07, the black helicopters started coming back again, like all the time. Like, it got so ridiculous, and I had a few friends, including one of which is here, who also witnessed one of the nastier attacks when they started flying over really low and they were projecting. And it makes you want to like throw up, and it feels like someone's choking you or in your stomach. With that's when they're in the projection mode versus scanning mode. And again, it started again, because I'm doing some meditations on my rooftop, this time in Astoria, and I have the helicopters flying by. And I'm like, oh great, this is like the old days, you know? Like, how are you guys able to track me so easily now, you know, again? And I started having dreams that part of me was stuck in some kind of facility that I need to break out of. And I was like, wow, what is this dream? Is there some part of my psyche that just is trapped by some kind of system, something that happened to me? And well, it was quite literal. That my subconscious was trying to scream out that there was an incident that I had forgotten about, which was the incident back in 96, 97. So then in 2006, 2007, I went up to Preston Nichols a couple of times to his machine. And one of the times I was there in the machine, it popped. And I saw myself coming out of this underground base that was out in the woods, and it was not a parent ball, it was underground, and it was more like a hatch door would open, you know, covered with trees, so nobody would even suspect that there was a facility there. And I could see other guys around me in the military there, So I jumped out at that point. I was kind of freaking out, but at the same time I felt like a weight lifted off my shoulder. And I talked to Preston. Preston jumped out of his trance state. He was meditating. And he said, oh, Stephen, I journeyed with you during that last piece of music, and I saw that you were taken to an underground base upstate New York in your mid-20s, like verbatim of exactly what I saw. He described it. So that made me even feel more impressed about Preston's capacity, because before that I was a little bit like, I know you've also been kind of screwed with, and I'm not sure exactly the full scope of what I can believe fully in terms of your perception. So it was a nice grounded confirmation about his psychic ability at that point. And he goes that he saw that there were 5 guys trying to work on me on the table, and that they were doing some procedure, but he couldn't get deeper. It was like a black energy around that he had to go. We'd have to do some more work with that. So, you know, I didn't really go back up there for that, but I thought about it. I decided then to just really hardcore work on my own process of digestion and peeling away layers. That began a really intense synchronicity chain of events where I met another wonderful individual friend who was very psychic and started channeling, and first started channeling some information about the abduction. It was more confirmation. My guides really came through her and started speaking verbatim to me about dreams and other things I had and began to confirm it. And basically, and then a few months after, well, about a month after this particular channeling, it came up that I had been implanted at that point in the facility. Basically had a brain chip, and that we needed to deactivate this brain chip. And this was part of the reason why I was experiencing all this extra harassment over the years, as well as the tracking. And then, because I mean, things were really kind of intense. I was very spiritual, but there was always points where I had to overcompensate for what I felt was intrusive energies trying to come in my space. And literally after 10 minutes of talking about these topics, I'd feel it almost looked like a little astral probe about the size of like a small baseball that would fly around astrally, like a little satellite eye. And for years I never talked about it because I think people thought I was crazy seeing that thing. It would fly around and it starts scanning me. I'm like, what is this technology? What is this thing flying around, you know? And how is it able to pick up on my field so quickly, 10 minutes after talking about stuff? And I'd seen 2 other psychic friends, and one in Jersey had seen it at the same time. And he goes, oh my God, Steve, what is that thing flying around you? And I'm like, oh my God, you actually see it. I said, that's awesome. I'm like, no, it's, he's like, no, it's not. I'm like, yes, it is. You have no idea. You know, this is some crazy like scalar technology or something they have, alien technology. And I was like, wait a minute. So then I realized, well, part of how it was able to come around so quick is because it was picking up, monitoring my brainwave activity when I would be discussing certain topics. That the actual chip would send out the signal, of course, and then they would respond appropriately with not so nice energies. So I had a couple of friends, and we started channeling energies to deactivate the chip. And it was one of the most profound experiences of like peace and quiet I've ever had. And it felt like something popped in my head, and I felt like wires in the top, like cutting through. And the friend working on me felt the same thing before I said it. And I was like, oh my God, what the hell's in my brain here? I didn't realize this was in my head. You know, but then afterwards, I felt like a floating head walking down the street, where there was a sense of peace and quietness, where finally, for the first time in 11 years, nobody could hear or sense what I was picking up on. Like I didn't feel like there were any other voices or things trying to push in my aura. I was like, wow, it's amazing what we get used to, and we have to overcompensate for things that we think are normal that really are not normal. You know, until you kind of break out of that parameter, like, oh my God, why did I live with that for so long without getting to that point of discovery? So then I decided to track down the individual upstate New York who had set me up for this, because I remembered more clearly that he was definitely the one. So I got him on the phone at least, and the first time I talked to him, he was a little more reluctant. He goes, you know, I started talking to him about it, which was a little odd thing for me to do too. Like, how do I can bring this up? You know, I want to go up there and just, you know, punch this guy because you know, I'm like, I'm going to try to be cordial with him on the phone. Oh yeah, you set me up for military abduction. Hi, you know. You know, his response was pretty interesting. At that point, he goes, well, how soon can you come back up here, Stephen? Was his first thing he said. I'm like, excuse me? He goes, well, your memories are correct, but my role may be a little different than you think. I'm like, yeah, okay, I'm going to believe that. And I'm like, well, I'm not exactly feeling too safe right now to go back up. He goes, don't worry, because you'll be fine this time. You will be safe if you come back up. And I'm like, no, I don't think so. And I'm like, why don't you tell a mutual friend more details, and she'll relay it to me, because she was coming down to the city. And he goes, no, I really can't talk to her about it. You know, and then he goes, well, your implant is still partially activated. I didn't mention anything about an implant to him. And I was like, what? I was like, SOP. I was like, you know, and he was actually correct. It took me another, like, almost a year to fully discover it, because I ended up psychically using that residue as a hacking into their own networks, so I could be able to tap into their systems and use the connection that was there to kind of go more easily into their underground facilities and start remote viewing them, you know, more efficiently. I was like, hey, if I'm going to play the game, I'm going to jump in the game harder, you know. So at the end of 07, 08, then I realized it was still partially activated, because I went to Sedona, and I was with a shaman friend out there named Blue Cloud, who's a really cool guy. And I woke up in the dream plane there with the most horrible headache and projections of like from facilities in Sedona, I started seeing all these like number sequences and patterns, images flashing like super fast in front of my third eye that were just being written across it. I'm like, oh my God, they're trying to download something or reactivate whatever's still partially active in my head. So he felt it right away, and we went out and did some soul retrieval, and he goes, oh yeah, your energy's like in 2 or 3 bases that are in Sedona, I could see them tracking you. So I'm like, oh, this is nice, and how many facilities do they have across the country doing this, you know, because I wasn't aware of the full level. And so then we had done some more work, and I felt a lot better after that, and deactivated it. And then about a year ago, I'm skipping a lot of stuff in between just to get the key points here. About a year ago, I felt like there was more missing keys that I hadn't yet discovered. I started having a lot of other things going on in terms of ET groups, about awarenesses of parallel reality, which ties back into the Montauk project in a way, pretty directly. Before this experience that I mentioned, I had talked to Preston again about another reality that I had been to out of body. Basically, I was living a parallel incarnation up to that point in 06 before I passed away in that parallel reality, which one of the names that parallel reality is called is Trinicon. And this thing needs to be blown out of the water because it's been kept so secret for so long. This is really part of what Fringe TV show was trying to get to a little bit, was the idea that there is this corporate intelligence liaison ship going on where we are journeying back and forth to this parallel universe, this other Earth reality. Although they didn't quite have it correctly in the TV show of how messed up this parallel reality is. But when I talked to this about Preston mentioned, he said that basically that they had called that Earth 2. And that there were several other realities that were parallel universes that were distinctive from their other, say, time travel experiments that they had done that he had been aware of at the time when he was working for the project. And I was like, oh, that's interesting confirmation, because the way they showed it to me, and the first the angels in a dream plane, was that there were 8 other realities that were closest, in like a fractal or like a lotus pattern, to our timeline here. And that if you were in our reality here, you would gaze and see the other 8 realities around you like petals of a lotus. And as you would go into that universe, in whatever form, and that becomes the center point, and the other 8 are around you. So it's holographic and fractal. Basically, they showed me that 6 of the closest parallel realities were beautiful. They were like utopia. They were very close to the ascension stage that we're heading to here in this reality. But the other 2 were in the opposite extreme. There was one that was post-apocalyptic, very much like Mad Max type movie, or Nostradamus timeline. It was very disturbing, very total destruction. And the other timeline was Trinicon 1. This one was like New World Order on crack. This was like everything they would love to do here, they've done it 100 times worse there. And I was like, wow, what do these realities have in common? I'm like, I'm going to trace this timeline all the way back and see what was the spawn of events. And what we realized was that it all started in Atlantis. Surprise, right? In Atlantis, in that parallel reality, Atlantis did not sink, but was won by the dark side. So imagine time flash forward, what kind of reality it'd be, and where you have these negative ETs working with the shadow black brotherhoods, running the planet. Not exactly a nice place, to visit. But of course, as part of Gaia's experience of giving souls option of free will to experience multiplicity of what third dimensional reality is about, she makes room for these explorations. So it's not about being fearful, it's understanding this allows us a further discourse of really being able to love things that we formerly perceive as unlovable, and being able to transmute and take our power back. So there's a lot of stories about that parallel reality, but I'm going to fast forward a little bit here. So I began to have other experiences where I started getting some harassment from projections coming from Trinicon. I started seeing areas over New York phasing in and out where I saw parallel buildings coming in and out from that reality. And I'm like, wow, this is getting a little bit crazy now. I was like Archangel Michael and other angels I'm working with. I don't know if I want to do this level of work. It's hard enough to get myself grounded in one reality. I have to deal with like the really dark one. But then I started meeting other people who were having dreams, what they thought were dreams about Trinicon, exactly the same kind of content describing, because most people are implanted there. There's an underground resistance that's gathering more momentum now, actually. But what I just come to discover later is that there are many facilities the U.S. government has that are underground that have taken off what Montauk project started with in terms of that aspect of parallel reality travel. And there is an alliance going on there where they're coming back and forth. And it's not a good one, because part of their desire is to create more. They're running out of time because our timelines are converging on a much grander scale, and so they know that they have to try to create more of their shadowy presence here if they want to have more of a start over in the new cycle. So they're trying the best they can to entangle our fields and entangle vortexes and implant people etherically with some of the doubles that we have, because a lot of people are living dual lifetimes over there. So we need to clear our field so that we don't pick up osmosis from this negative reality, but rather send it love and unity. So one of the things that came up at the facility when I have more memory about it, well, I'm speaking a little faster just to get to the core points of it. I began to realize that facility upstate New York was one of these facilities, and that they were bringing people who they were abducting not only to that facility in New York State, but they were going over to Trinicon. and that they were also chipping people in Trinicon and then bringing them back to that facility there. And GE is one of the companies involved in this up there. GE and NSA are for sure involved in that facility. There's other military groups I'm not aware of yet. I got multiple confirmations of people who lived in green, and they would see military vehicles driving in and out of the forest in green, and they would just disappear. Like, but there's no official base in Green, New York, or in Bowman Lake, but the vehicles go all the time. I met one other woman recently who was taken to that facility, and it was the first person I met who had a memory of it too, and I was like, wow, really emotional. She also knew the guy John too. So I forget the guy upstate who was involved in that. So anyway, so I called him up again. I'm like, all right, I'm going to call the guy who set me up again, see if he had any more information for me. And as soon as I mentioned to him about GE, he starts laughing. He goes, yeah. He goes, well, at the time when I was working at the facility, I wasn't aware of that company's presence in terms of their level of role they were playing. But later on, I come to realize that that company was heavily involved in the facility. And I was like, oh, that makes sense. And then I mentioned to him about the Montauk extension idea, that they were going to people, that they were doing parallel reality travel there. He starts laughing on the phone again. He goes, well, now you finally got it. He goes, as a matter of fact, they took you to the other reality, and when they brought you back, only a few minutes passed in our reality, so you weren't aware of how long you were taken. And I was like, that makes sense why it didn't have logical linear missing time in this reality, because they had the technology to bring you back. So I was like, oh great, now I have a whole other thing to process. There's a whole other level of stuff. And but it made it more clear that I've been doing more work with people and clients who are living over there, and I'm gathering more data about it. And there's really interesting. They're definitely doing something else well in Long Island, because two people I worked on were off in like the North Shore were getting triggered from some facility up there that's been dealing with Trinicon. They were having black helicopters and remote viewers coming over from the parallel Earth as well. So I've been tracking at Expo, but we definitely know that there's multiple facilities that are dealing with this. Now there's a lot more to this. I'm trying to think. What's my time cue here actually? Was it 5 minutes? 10 minutes. Okay, 10 minutes. Cool. Okay. Yeah, cool. Okay, I'll backtrack. So I'll backtrack to one of the guys, another scientist I met back in was it 05, 04? 04 or 03? I met with the one in Yucatan. I'm trying to remember.
03.
Oh, 03, yeah, you have to remember that, yeah. So I take a trip to Yucatan as just part of a guided journey. I need to go down to Koba and Chichen Itza, mainly the Koba, and do some energy work. And one of the guys I meet out there was a UFO researcher who was filming a documentary, just synchronistically. At the time I was there, and he showed me some of the raw footage of a UFO that was hovering over the trees about a mile away that he was zooming into. And the other person I met there was a Green Beret, who happened just to be there, walking down, you know. And I was like, all right, this is interesting. Special ops guy who claimed to be in between missions, and I'm like, this is very suspicious. Anyway, that's kind of a whole other story, but he ended up trying to befriend me. We actually became friends. I felt the connection to him on a higher level, but I didn't trust him for the whole first year. He was going back and forth between Iraq and he would visit me a couple weeks at a time in New York when he was in between missions. Although I come to find out later on that initially he met me, it wasn't by accident, but he was kind of dropped off in my area, but then he realized I wasn't a threat, so he wanted to become my friend, which I kind of felt on a higher level was true. So I'm like, all right, there are light workers in very dark areas, as many people over here know as well. So I decided to keep that relation for a while. At the same time, the day after I returned from that trip, I met an individual who I dreamt of a few hours before, when I was still working at that job, of a scientist who was, in the dream plane, he was showing me how they were using holographic technology and advanced laser systems as another level to open up doorways between realities and time travel. I was very intrigued, so I'm like, all right, that's interesting, what am I going to do with that, whatever. So I go to work that day, boom, a guy I see who's reading a newspaper at my job, waiting for the bus. I'm telling the armored car guys about the UFO I saw, and the guy with the newspaper pulls down. He asked me if I saw any army guys out there with machine guns in a jungle, and I'm like, no. He goes, well, the U.S. has a base in Yucatan. I'm like, okay, I didn't know that. And he goes, well, and I'm like, well, who are you? He goes, well, I'm an engineer and a scientist and working in Black Ops. I'm like, oh, I just dreamt of you this morning. I'm like, hi, it's nice to get a little bit of preview, And I'm like, all right. So I start talking a little more, and I'm like, what do you know about parallel reality stuff or about Montauk? He goes, well, I can either confirm or deny any of that, but my specialty was radio frequency, and I'm like, all right, that's nice. And he starts mentioning about other projects, how they were doing some experimentation on children, and they said that they were trying to access the Akashic records, or universal information fields, through children because they thought they had more direct access, but that project he knew about wasn't having as much success. So I'm like, well, that's really nice of you guys. And at that point, he was also upgrading the NSA spy satellite system. I was like, that's a really good job, And so he began to meet with me a couple of times, and he was working both for the private sector and for the NSA. I'm like, NSA again, they keep coming up all the time. And then the best time he confirmed things to me was later on, about a year later. again, he appears, I say, you know, when I'm getting a bus ride back to that facility, I feel his energy, and all of a sudden he's in the front of the line, he waves to me, I'm like, oh, hi, you know? So I get in the bus, I don't actually see him, but then I see him after looking at the same seat 3 times, I'm like, what are you, like, phasing it out on me or something? And he had a very distinctive signature. I only felt that one at a time with another scientist I met, another guy I met, a few years later, who freaked out when I called the shots and said that he was working with the same guy, and he ran away at that point. And I'm like, you have the same signature. You guys are like, you know, you're partners or something. So anyway, so this particular scientist then told me, I was like, all right, tell me more about the parallel reality stuff, you know, and he goes, well, okay, sure. He goes, yeah, the US has been doing time travel, parallel reality travel for many years. He goes, in fact, part of the experimentation on the Human Genome Project was about trying to develop a new type of energy field of protection for the travelers, because they were getting a lot of health problems when they were going back in time. So they wanted to make a specific type of EM field that was more stable, that was linked up to their DNA. I'm like, oh, that's cool, that makes sense. Reminded me of what Preston said about some of the things that they were doing as well to keep like the time reference in place. So then he goes, oh yeah, parallel reality travel. Yeah, he goes, in fact, he goes, what they're doing now, this is back in 03, he goes, they've been having a lot of problems trying to manipulate our timeline, because every time they go back in the past and try to change an event, it affects other timelines. So he said that they were now cooking up a new idea that they were about to do it and try, and that they wanted to go to a parallel Earth, then jump back in time there. And then once they jump back in time there, then jump back across to our timeline and manipulate the event. I'm like, wow, that sounds like a bit of an interesting way to do it. And I'm like, that's a weird, you know. So I was like, okay, at least this is cool. You're at least being more honest with me this time about it, you know. And then, you know, but then he had to interrupt the meeting. He goes, well, I really can't stand anywhere more than 15 minutes because my phone will ring now because I'm working again for these people, and they track my position everywhere I go, and they wonder why I'm standing somewhere longer than 15 minutes unless it's authorized. And I'm like, okay, that's a nice life. All right, you know, I'll talk to you later. You know, but he said one other fascinating thing that ties back into the grid work, their whole Ryan work. One of the first things he actually said to me in the first meeting was that he goes, he said that he was a scientist. He was one of the scientists that shot lasers through the chambers in the Great Pyramid to confirm whether it was Orion that the pyramids were lined up to. And he goes, isn't it interesting that the pyramids were lined up to Orion, the birthplace of life in our local sector of the galaxy? And I'm like, wow, what an interesting comment to make, you know, for a black ops scientist, right? It's kind of like phasing it out here. It's been, you know, a very, very intriguing road. Now, there are other corporations involved too that have been, you know, part of my contract with my higher self is that I kind of like to keep abreast of some of these remote technologies they use for harassment, so I can develop countermeasures and help people, you know, in their auric field developing it. So there have been many other things I've experienced that have been built up, or several other people that have met with me or tried to infiltrate my group, or even a few guys on Facebook, which I laugh at because they're pretty obvious, you know, that they're not who they say they are, or they are actually admitting it. There's one other company called, another big famous company called L3. They have another interesting technology which I've experienced, which they were referring to it as the time displacement unit. And so they've gotten very creative in ways that they've tried to manipulate people's auric energy fields and meridian lines in order to dissociate their consciousness or create more permeable ways in which they can, you know, override your sense of self, so that you're more manipulable. So they were showing me that they had technology with that there were 15 points on everybody's auric field in the back. Basically, that they were lined up in rows of 3, going down from the top of the back down to the base. Now these were temporal reference place points, and that they had technology where they could basically try to interrupt the flow between those points. And the more they interrupted those points, the more they would displace your consciousness to a prior time frame. So almost like taking the idea of not feeling grounded to a whole new level. So it's almost like kicking someone out of their body partially. And that the idea there was that then they wanted to send an agent astrally and create what they call a partial walk-in. Basically, where they would send an astral agent's persona going out of the body to try to stand in that person's field while their consciousness was partially displaced, and use them temporarily, you know, for things that they had no idea. So I was like, oh, that's pretty crazy. And I started getting hit with projections when I went on their website after the guys were showing me this in a dream plane. I had to turn off the computer. I was like, wow, they're projecting nasty frequencies to this. And then I meet a guy in the subway right after that who appears in my neighborhood, starts talking about Brookhaven and Montauk. I'm like, well, okay, hi. You know? And I eventually he's on the phone and just starts a whole series of conversations that were very disturbing. And I'm like, okay, and I look at his field, I'm like, you're one of these partial walk-ins. And I'm like, you know, and then you know, I lost his number, and then he popped up 2 months later again after I lost his number in the subway again and wanted to make sure I had his number. and so I set up a meeting with me and another guy in New York who is a famous psychic that went to some interesting other situation. That's a longer story. But anyway, so there's a lot of these little fascinating projects that are still going on where they're getting quite creative. But the idea is the more you claim your sovereignty over your chakras, over your tree of life, over your Sephiroth, because I work a lot with that, the more you're able to decloak these manipulative agendas and be able to substitute the false symbols that they try to place in your field and put your own positive symbols. Because what they're basically really terrified of is just that our DNA is evolving. They're totally aware that we're heading to a new critical 100 monkey principle shift of our morphogenetic field, and they're trying to slow down that process. So they've gone out of their way to try to manipulate our DNA or try to de-evolve it through sending other types of introduction of serpentine or reptilian DNA as one of their other projects that I've been aware of. So part of this, is understanding the more we bring love and unity into our DNA and work with that energy, we're able to transmute those, those negative aspects of what they're doing in the chemtrails and heavy metals, which are also designed to try to weigh down our DNA, because they're basically terrified.